Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be going over chapter 1, which is communication perspectives. Okay, so these are a few of our learning objectives. Basically, we're just going to be covering what communication is in general, kind of the process of that. We're going to identify characteristics of communication. We're going to talk about assessing messages and developing a personal communication improvement plan. All right, so what is communication? It is a complex process through which people express, interpret, and coordinate messages with others. So basically, when you think about having a conversation with somebody, that is communication, obviously, and we're going to go deeper into that and the process of it. But basically, here are some pieces of the communication process that we need to understand. So messages, these are the verbal utterances, visual images, and nonverbal behaviors used to convey thoughts and feelings. So, and if you think about a conversation with someone, you obviously are creating a message with your words, but also when it says nonverbal behaviors, it's also talking about your body language, right? Like, so if someone's talking to you and you're nodding to show that you understand, that's still communicating and sending a message, even though you don't verbally say, yes, I understand. Right. So that's messages. You also encode messages and decode messages. So encoding is the process of actually creating the message, like your brain working to construct messages to send to other people. So that could be obviously the verbal messages. It could also be your body language. All of that. That's encoding. That's you making it, creating the message. And then decoding is when you receive a message from someone and you process that and you interpret the message, right? So you're interpreting what someone's saying to you or what their body language is saying to you. You're interpreting. And a lot of times that sometimes is going on simultaneously, right? Like you're talking to someone and they're nodding and showing they understand, and you're watching them nod. And so you're decoding that message while you're still encoding and sending a message. Does that make sense? So these things can kind of go on simultaneously. And then feedback. So the verbal and nonverbal messages sent by receivers to let senders know how the message is being interpreted. So while people are decoding, so say I say something to you and you take in that message and you think about it and then you respond, that is your feedback, right? That's after you've decoded the message and you've encoded your own message to send back to me. That is feedback. Okay, canned plans and scripts. So a canned plan is a mental library of scripts that individuals draw from to create messages based on what has worked for them or others in the past. So basically, your brain is like a filing cabinet that just stores all these different situations and it learns from those situations. So how to communicate in that particular situation or how to act in this particular situation. Like thinking about the classroom, you come into the class, to sit down, get your notes out. When the teacher is talking, you're typically quiet unless asked a question, and then you discuss, right? And that is kind of a canned plan. It's like a script. You understand what to do in that situation, and you communicate in a way that matches that situation. Like you communicate with a professor in a certain way, and that's probably going to be a little different than how you communicate with one of your best friends, right? Depending on the context and the situation, you act and communicate in a certain way, but you have a mental library of how you communicate. So a script is an actual text of what you say and do in a specific situation. While we don't actually have scripts that we walk around with, we kind of have these ideas that we understand, especially if you think about in a culture. If you think about walking down the hallway and someone nods at you and says, how are you doing? That's kind of a script, right? You know to say next, I'm good. How are you? Good. Have a nice day. That's a script because you've had that kind of conversation with a lot of people probably in your past, right? And that's kind of why those mental libraries are great, because that way it helps us learn how to communicate with others in a multitude of situations. So scripts help us feel comfortable in situations and it helps us know how to communicate with others. So developed from one's past experiences and observations. Again, like I just said, the reason why you probably, if someone asked you, how are you in passing, you probably say, I'm doing good, how are you? Because of past experiences, or maybe you've seen that. I remember when I was younger, my dad was driving down the road, and this is still communication. It wasn't a conversation, but I noticed something. I observed my dad doing this. So we're driving on the road and there's a guy walking on the road and he just nodded and waved his hand. My dad nodded and waved his hand back. And I looked at my dad and said, "Why did you just do that?" And he goes, "Well, that's just saying hi, or just like, how do you do, or hope you're doing well. It's just something that you do." And so I go, okay. So after that, I started doing it. And to this day, if I just see someone going down the road or make eye contact with somebody, and so I always wave my hand and nod to say hello. But I watched my dad do that. I observed it. And while that's not me having a physical, like an actual conversation with that person, I am still communicating a message to them by waving. I'm saying, "Hello, how are you?" Right? And they know that, especially in our culture, I guess I could say they know that. That came from past experiences, and that also it comes from observation. So speech is customized depending on the audience and the situation. Again, like I said, being in a classroom and how we communicate in a classroom is going to be different than how we communicate with our best friends or even our family, or just the people that we're close to. Also, if how you communicate with someone that you don't really know versus someone you know well. Right? The way that you communicate all depends on the audience and the situation. All right, communication context. So context basically just means the situation, what's going on around you, right? So there's physical, social, historical, psychological, and cultural situations that surround a communication event, and we'll go through those. Achieving the ideal communication situation is impossible. One gets closer to this goal by considering communication context. So basically, it's just saying, the ideal communication situation that like we want for everyday situations. It's not always going to happen, right? There's always going to be distractions. There's things that are going to be going on. But it's like we get closer to finding that ideal communication situation when we observe the context and we think about where we are, right? So affect the expectations of participants. The context that we're in, or the context you're in, the situation that you're in, it definitely affects what you expect from the other person. Like if you're on a date sitting down with one other person, how you communicate in that situation is going to be different than how you communicate in a small group situation. And the context and the people that end up being there, that kind of dictates your expectations for communication, right? You would expect that on a one-on-one situation that you would both communicate quite a bit. In a small group situation where there's maybe 5 to 6 people, maybe you're not talking all the time, right? That's your expectation. So you just want to think about what are the expectations of the other participants within this context. So physical context, location of a communication encounter and the environmental conditions surrounding it. So the actual like physical place that you're in and the physical proximity of the participants, like I said, I mean, me in a class, I was in a classroom, how I'm in front of the classroom and you're further back, that is a context, right? That's going to be different than if say you and I meet one-on-one for a conference in my office and we're sitting down face to face with each other. There's a difference there. That's a physical difference of like different physical context difference, if that makes sense. Different context due to physicalities. Okay, and then physical situation may also be virtual. So thinking about like social media, virtual presence, all those things, that can also be part of the physical context realm, I guess you could say. Social presence, virtual presence, that's also part of that. So social context is the nature of the relationship that already exists between participants. So say that you are, so social context is like if you think about you already know some friends that you have and y'all are all going to eat and you're hanging out talking, right? The way that you communicate in that situation is dependent upon your social context. You already had a relationship. If you're meeting someone for the very first time, your communication is going to be a little bit different because you don't have that history of a relationship, which brings us to historical context. Background provided by previous communication between participants also is a context, and it's also going to dictate how you communicate, right? If you have known someone since childhood, you are going to communicate with them very different. The context in which you normally communicate is going to be different than like you just meeting me at the beginning of the semester and us communicating. So your historical context also impacts your communication. Psychological context, moods and feelings each person brings to a communication encounter. So how you feel and how you feel about the other person, like the mood that you're in, all of that is going to dictate how you are, I gotta answer this call. My mom keeps calling me, I'm sorry. Hey mom, I'm recording a lecture. Okay, bye. All right, back to it. Sorry. So psychological context, moods and feelings each person brings. So yes, so how you feel about somebody is going to be dictated by the psychological context. Maybe you're in a bad mood, so your communication is kind of off that day. Or maybe you're talking to a coworker that you don't really get along with. That's going to have an impact, right? So then also cultural context, beliefs, values, orientations, underlying assumptions, orientations, and rituals that belong to a specific culture. So how you basically, the culture that you're in is going to dictate the context as well. So if you grew up in the South or in America or wherever you were born and where you grew up, especially if you were born somewhere else and they have now come to America, you may also feel like okay, there's a very difference in the culture, how you communicate. Or if you're from one culture and someone comes to your culture that's, y'all communicate, you're going to see a difference, not just in how they communicate, the way in which they say words, but actually like just little tendencies that they have, right? So it's all also dependent upon the culture you grow up in, how you're supposed to communicate with one another, right? Like even think about like that wave I was talking about. In other cultures, that might be kind of weird to wave. If you think about like in the South, opening the door, being polite and doing all these little cordial things for people, that's the thing that you do. Now, if you go up to the north, that's not, they don't put as much, they don't put as much emphasis on that. Like they don't really care about opening the door maybe for you. Like in the South, if I'm going in the bank and I realize someone's behind me, I'm probably going to stop and keep the door open for them just to be nice. That might not happen somewhere else due to the culture, right? So you can see how culture also is going to impact the context and the communication that happens within that context. Okay, communication settings. Different communication environments are characterized by a number of participants, level of formality, and interactions. So, like I said, if you meet with me one-on-one in my office, that's going to be different than if we're meeting in class, right? Because in class, you think about the number of people, the formality is different because it is actually like a class situation. Whereas in my office, there's still a level of formality, but it's not quite as formal as it would be in the classroom situation. Plus, it's one-on-one, so that's going to change the communication setting. Interpersonal communication, interactions that occur in one's mind when talking to oneself. So you basically have like this inner communication that's going on a lot, right? That's just you think your thoughts. So you're thinking, you're talking to yourself. You talk to yourself about a lot of things, and sometimes that can be negative and sometimes that's good. So basically that is that inner talk that you have in your own mind. Interpersonal communication is informal interactions between two people who have an identifiable relationship with one another, meaning this isn't going to be like you and some random person on the road that you see. This is going to be you and you and I in the classroom. That's an interpersonal communication because we have some kind of identifiable relationship. Like I am your teacher, you are my student. That's an identifiable relationship. So just make sure not to get those two confused. Intrapersonal is, like you're thinking inwardly. Interpersonal means like between two people. Then you have small group communication. That's 3 to 20 people who come together to interact. So like this would be maybe if you have a job somewhere and you're working with multiple people at a time, that's probably going to be a lot of small group communication. If I ever put you in groups to work on a project, that's also going to be small group communication. Okay, public communication. One participant delivers a message to a group of more than 20 people. So that would be more like me teaching a class, or you doing some kind of public speaking thing, or maybe presenting to a business, whatever it is, but it's more of a presentation style, right? And then you have mass communication. And these are messages delivered by individuals and entities through mass media to large segments of the population. So this is going to be like a presidential address or the news, right? That's mass communication. They're presenting to a camera that's going to be filtering that to a lot of people. All right, so the communication process. So this is a complex set of interrelated activities intended to result in shared meaning. Shared meaning just means a meaning that both people within the communication process understand. So you have message production, message interpretation, and then interaction coordination. So message production is steps taken to encode the message. Remember, that's when we actually construct our message that we're going to send. Message interpretation, this is steps taken to decode the message. That's where we break it down, understand. And then interaction coordination, behavioral adjustments made by participants in an attempt to create shared meaning. So this might be like, as you start to understand each other, like the way you communicate, you'll start to realize, are we on the same page? Are we not on the same page? And so then you communicate in a way that you try to get to that same understanding, right? I had a student the other day that was asking me a question about something, and I thought that they were asking me one thing, and they were like, oh no, this is what I'm meaning. And it's like we had to communicate till we finally both got to that same point where I was like, oh, okay, I understand what you're saying. Then we had shared meaning. So then there's channels. This is also part of that communication process. So channels, route traveled by and means of transportation of a message. So this is the way in which you send a message to somebody else. And these channels can be face-to-face communication, verbal symbols, nonverbal cues, visual images. So this can be like, obviously, face-to-face, you're talking with one another. You're talking about like verbally saying things. You can also send nonverbal cues face-to-face. So you can say, like, you can smile, you can shrug, you can nod your head. You can also do this virtually. I mean, you think about like emojis, all that, like you type something and then you send that. And then visual images. And so then the best channel can be determined by considering media richness, so the amount and the kinds of information transmitted via a particular channel. And then I can never say this, but synchronicity, sorry, synchronicity, extent to which a channel allows for immediate feedback, helps clarify potential misunderstandings. So like, if you think about, I think in the book, there's a graph, and on that graph, it shows the most synchronicity and the most media richness. And so it's showing you how well, like it gives you all these different situations telling you how well something works, a channel works, and how like little it does it works. So on one end, synchronicity would be like actual face-to-face communication. That would allow for immediate feedback, right? Because that would be, I see you face-to-face, I can see your facial expressions. That maybe also like a Zoom call could be kind of close to that. And then kind of in the middle would be like text messaging, right? In the middle, you can get pretty immediate, but what if someone's not by their phone? It takes a little bit, right? And then the least synchronicity type message would be like sending someone, I don't know, mass letters in the mail or something like that. If you've ever gotten to junk mail, that would be like the least synchronicity, right? So those are channels that we're looking at. So here's this is what I was talking about. So the continuum of communication channels, this is the graph I was talking about. So you see this over here, it's like you find the most synchronicity if you have face-to-face conversation. That makes it rich, right? Rich communication, because you get to see it, you see the person, you see their reactions, and it's just continuous. And then it goes down the line of like Skype would be next to that, phone, interactive chat, which would be kind of like text messaging or something. Oh, sorry, that's not interactive chat, would be a little different. And then Facebook, all the social media things. Then we get to like text messages and email, because it's a little bit, it is immediate, but if someone's not right by their phone, it's not quite as immediate. And then over here, the least rich or least synchronicity we would find would be bulk letters, posters, email, spam, like anything like that, right? Okay, interference or noise. So noise is basically like when we send a message, what interferes with us hearing that message? So that might be physical noise or psychological noise. Physical noise would be any type of thing that's like that distracts you, like a sound or something you see or something like that. Say, one of my favorite examples has always been, say you hear two people, you're in class with me where I'm lecturing, and then all of a sudden you hear these two people fighting in the hallway. And all of a sudden you start listening and you start realizing that they're breaking up, right? They're having a fight and they're breaking up. And you are listening to this, that would actually be physical noise, right? Like you physically, there is something actually out there, like a noise that you were listening to that you can't really help but listen to, right? Because it's right there, they're yelling at each other, breaking up. A psychological noise would be more like what's going on in your head, what's causing like you to be distracted. This could be maybe your thoughts, your feelings. So maybe they're done fighting, they've broken up, they've gone their separate ways, and I continue on with my lecture. But now you're thinking about your recent breakup, right? Like you and your significant other just broke up a couple of weeks ago and you're sad about it still. And so now all of a sudden you're just all out some psychological noise, right? Like you're sad, you're thinking about that. You can't really think about what I'm talking about because you're thinking about your ex. So that would be psychological noise. So psychological noise, thoughts and feelings. Physical noise are actually something that's present that distracts you from the message. All right, so here's the model of communication. So everything that we've gone over till now is kind of shown in this model. So you have the context, and you have like that kind of circles everything, right? So depending on the context, that's going to determine how the two participants are going to communicate. So you have the participants, it's the people within that are having the conversation. They're simultaneously sending and receiving verbal and nonverbal messages because we're assuming these two people are face to face. So they are continuously sending these messages. And these messages are going through a channel, right? So that this is a face-to-face channel. So you're basically just having conversation face-to-face. And then psychological interference is there, like they're both thinking about what's going on. Maybe they have something, they're either stressed out or anxious, so they're not able to listen very well. They're both dealing with their own psychological interference. And then there's physical interference. So there's always going to be stuff going on around you, right? There's always going to be something happening, sometimes less or sometimes more, but there's always going to be something going on around. So you can see how all of these things kind of come together as part of the communication process. Okay, characteristics of communication. So it's purposeful, it's continuous, irreversible, and that just is basically saying like once it's said, right? Even if you put it on social media, like there is that footprint, right? Online footprint that you make, that if you put it out there, people can kind of dig that up. So it's irreversible. It's situated, depends on the situation, and it's indexical, varies in conscious thought, and it is guided by cultural norms. All right, so the purposes of communication: to develop and maintain one's sense of self. So the sense of self is like you're constant, we'll go into this later in a different chapter, but your sense of self is constantly developing, right? Based on what you talk about yourself, what you think about yourself, and what others say about you, what you perceive others think about you. That is just constantly, you're constantly maintaining and shifting your sense of self. And that's one of the purposes of communication. So then also to meet social needs. I mean, we all are social people, and we're all like humans need others. That's why one of the worst things that we can, punishments is social isolation, right? Like, so we want to be social with other people. Even if you're like, I'm not a social person, most people don't want to just sit and that's without ever speaking or talking or seeing anybody, right? We still want some kind of interaction, some kind of communication process with others. To develop and maintain relationships. So if you want to maintain a relationship, if you have a really good friend, you have to continuously communicate with that person to keep that relationship alive. When those relationships end, or if you stop talking, that relationship's going to end. That's just what naturally happens. Like you can think of someone you used to be close to, and now you're not so close to them. It's probably because slowly but surely your communication became less and less. And then to exchange information, obviously, like communication is the best way to just get a job done, right? You need to tell someone, especially at work, if you think about that, like you have to exchange information, you have to get that one point to the other. We do that through communication. And to influence others, right? That's also a part of it. So like I said, communication is continuous, irreversible, and situated. messages are constantly being encoded and decoded. So it's continuous. Anytime you're around other people, you're constantly encoding and decoding, even if you don't say a word to one another, you're still encoding and decoding, depending upon, like, when you look at other people, if you're, it doesn't matter, it's always happening. So once communication takes place, one can never go back in time and erase it. And like I said earlier, you make an electronic, even like on social media, you make that electronic footprint. It's there, it's out there for people to see. So you can't ever really go back, especially, and that's kind of why sometimes communication can be hurtful. Like, you can hurt someone's feeling. You can't take back something that you say, but you can also try to heal that process as well, or heal that wound as well, by using communication to ask for forgiveness for hurting someone's feelings, right? But either way, it's irreversible. You can't take it back. Communication occurs within a specific setting that affects how messages are produced, interpreted, and coordinated, and that's kind of like what I talked about before with context. All right, communication is indexical. Index, measure of the emotional temperature of one's relationship at a particular time. A message exchange can signal the level of trust, control, and intimacy in a relationship. So you can kind of see like how much you can kind of index the emotional temperature between people. If you even think about like non-verbally, you can see that a lot, right? Like if two people are talking and one person's sitting like this from the other person, you can kind of, gauge the emotional temperature that maybe they're in a fight, right? You can also see the level of trust, control, and intimacy with people. Like, so if, like, say you're working on a group project with someone you've never really got to know before, you might sit a little further apart. Whereas, say you start working on a project with your significant other, you're probably going to sit closer to one another, or you're not going to worry about the space as much. So you can kind of see the way that people communicate and how they look, how they use their body, all those things. It signals a level of trust and control, even, and intimacy. And then complementary feedback, message that signals agreement about who's in control. And then symmetrical feedback, message that signals disagreement about who is in control. So you can also kind of see by the way people communicate with their verbal language, also with their body language, who's trying to kind of fight for that control sometimes, especially if you think about that like in a workplace situation. You can kind of see people trying to get ahead of somebody else, and they do that sometimes even just with the way they communicate with one another, how they act, all of that. So there's that. And then communication and conscious thought. So messages may be spontaneous expression. So something spoken without much, it's like you just say it without thinking, and some of us are kind of bad about that. You may be one of those people that you don't think a lot about what you say and you just say it. And then other people think a lot about what they say. They're constructed, so formed carefully and thoughtfully when one's own known scripts are inadequate for the situation. So say you go into a situation that you've never really been in before, you don't know how to communicate or what to do or say in that particular situation. And so your scripts that you've always had are kind of inadequate for the situation. So you have to think about now, make up like what you want to say. And so a lot of people will be very conscious. They'll think about that. They'll construct their new message thoughtfully, right? So you kind of have, and then you want to also, I want to say, like, you always kind of want to have a blend of that too. So you want to be able to be yourself and be spontaneous, but you also want to think about, you also want to think carefully and be constructed at the same time, so that you're thinking and being respectful to other people. All right, culture, system of shared beliefs, values, symbols, and behaviors. So a culture, communication and culture go hand in hand, right? Culture is built on communication, and communication builds culture. So if you think about that, how you communicate within a culture, that's, how we share our beliefs, like this says, how we learn about values, the words that we use, symbols are like the words that we use, and behaviors. So like how you're supposed to act within certain situations, that all depends on your culture. The information and interpretation of messages depend on the cultural background of the participants. So like how you interpret a message it will be greatly dictated by the culture you grew up in, right? And then how you actually communicate a message to others is going to be dictated by the culture you grew up in. You know, one person might say something a certain way and the other person sees it as rude, but the other person who said it didn't know that that would be considered rude because maybe in their culture it isn't, right? So you have to think about the culture you grow up in is going to absolutely dictate how you communicate with others and you interpret the messages that people communicate with you. Communication and ethics. Ethics is a set of moral principles held by a society, a group, or an individual. So these are kind of like basically how do you live life? These are your moral principles. Ethical communicators are honest and responsible. They act with integrity, they behave fairly, and they demonstrate respect. So basically, as communicators, that's what we're all trying to be. The world would be a much better place. Like, think about that. What if everybody in the world tried to be an ethical communicator? It'd be a much happier place sometimes, right? So that's our job. If we are learning about communication, you know, like I said, this class is not just about public speaking. It's about learning how to communicate in all types of situations and relationships. This is what we want to do. We want to focus on becoming an ethical communicator. And so we want to be honest and responsible with the language that we use. We also want to act with integrity and behave fairly, right? And then demonstrate respect to all individuals. So we have these ideas of the bright side and the dark side of messages. And so again, in the book, they have a graph that you can look at about this. And it says bright side messages that are ethical and appropriate. So that thinking about how we want to say something and making sure that what we say is going to help the situation, it's going to better the people around us. How we say it's not going to be hurtful. The dark side of messages that are not ethical and or appropriate. And there's several types of dark messages. Because if you look at the graph there is, let me see if it's up next. No, it's not. Okay, but you can look in the book and it has like a diagram and it shows you there's three sides of that dark message. And so there's a hard side, which is honest, but also potentially damaging to a relationship. So maybe you're being honest, and I've heard people say this, you're like, hey, I'm just an honest person. I'm just going to tell it how it is. Okay, that's good. It's good to be honest, but we also can think about how to communicate that honest message in a way that's also not hurtful to others. Like, we don't want to damage a relationship or hurt the person that we're talking to. You can still be honest. That's part of being ethical. You should be honest, but also make it an appropriate message that's not going to hurt other people. And then easy dark side messages are dishonest in order to maintain a good relationship. So like I said, we don't want to be dishonest and just not communicate things or lie about what we think. We don't want to do that because that can also be damaging. And then there's evil dark side messages, disrespectful and damaging to a relationship. So this is basically just saying like you're just being disrespectful just to be disrespectful, or maybe you're angry at the person, maybe y'all are having an argument, that kind of thing. Communication competence. So impression that communicative behavior is both appropriate and effective in a given situation. So basically, communication, competence is talking about, are you competent in understanding the situation? Are you able to logically understand what's going on and what's needed in the situation? So someone that has communication competence can understand that communication is effective when it achieves its goals. Like, you understand what is the goal here, what's the point of the communication, and you achieve that goal. Appropriate when it conforms to what is expected in the situation. So again, you're thinking about right now, when the context and situation, what is needed from me as one of the people communicating. And then achieve through personal motivation, knowledge, and then skills, practice, credibility, and social ease. So, sorry, knowledge acquisition. I don't think I actually said that word fully. So knowledge acquisition, skills, practice, credibility, and social ease. So credibility, perception of speaker's knowledge, trustworthiness, and warmth. So how you come off as an individual, that's your credibility. How do you seem? And then social ease. So communicating without appearing to be anxious or nervous. So again, a communication competence also has to do with how, like, your social ease and how you seem to other people. Do you constantly seem nervous when you're communicating? Like, that's going to lessen how people see your communication competence, your ability to communicate well. So these are two things that we want to work on. Like, right, we want to work on our credibility, showing that we have knowledge and are trustworthy and warm, how we treat people. but also that social ease of trying to appear less anxious and nervous when we're communicating. So this leads us to communication apprehension. So this is the fear and anxiety associated with real or anticipated communication with others. All of us have a level of communication apprehension. So this is not like you either have it or you don't. It's a scale, right? Some people are really anxious about communicating in almost any situation, except maybe with the people they are absolutely closest to. Whereas some people, they can't meet a stranger and they have absolutely no fear, but with meeting people, but maybe they'd be really nervous with public speaking. And then some people might not literally have a care in the world when it comes to communication apprehension, so there's that scale. We all fall somewhere on that scale. So types are that's trait-like, audience-based, situational, and context-based. So like I just said, this might be a trait-like, communication apprehension can be trait-like in that you're just kind of like that, right? Like you're just kind of maybe communication's just always kind of made you anxious. It doesn't matter the situation, you're just kind of anxious about it. Audience-based, it might be that you're not necessarily anxious with your family or friends or with people you kind of know, but the first time you meet someone, you get kind of anxious about communicating with them. Then there's situational, and that might be that maybe it doesn't bother you to meet new people, maybe it doesn't bother you to communicate in lots of situations. It's really just like if you had to talk in front of several people, or if you had to give you have to speak in front of a classroom, or depending on the situation, you become nervous. And then context-based, again, it has to do with just whatever context I'm in, right? If it's like, say you're meeting somebody, like their significant other's parents for the first time, the context, right? That like context of everything could also make you nervous. Maybe being in a classroom makes you nervous. That's a context, right? So situational and context kind of go hand in hand. Okay, so now we're going to talk about communication improvement plans. So this is what we want to think about for becoming a better communicator, having more confidence with our communication. So we first want to identify our problem. So where do you think that you have issues with communication? Then state the specific goal. What is the goal that you want to do? How do you see yourself, like, if this is my problem, then talk about where you want to be. How do you want to grow? How do you want to fix that problem? And then outline a specific procedure of reaching the goal and devise a method for measuring the progress. So I believe in the book, it gives you an example of that towards the end of the chapter. Let me look at that real quick. All right, yeah, so it gives you an example on figure 1.4, and it says, okay, so the problem is when I speak in class or in the student senate, I often find myself burying my head in my notes or looking at the ceiling or walls. Okay, so that's the problem. Goal, to look at people more directly when I'm giving a speech. So they realize, okay, so I tend to do this, bury my face when I give a speech. So my goal is to not do that. I want to actually look at people when I speak. Procedure. I will take the time to practice oral presentations aloud in my room. 1, I will stand up just as I do in class. 2, I'll pretend various objects in the room are people, and I will consciously attempt to look at those objects as I'm talking. 3, when giving a speech, I will try to be aware of when I am looking at my audience and when I'm not. Okay, so that's now they have outlined a specific procedure. And then finally, test for measuring progress toward goal achievement. I'll have made positive progress when I am maintaining eye contact with my audience most of the time. So they have they know this is what I'm really trying to achieve. This is how I'm going to do it. All right. So, you take some time, maybe think about that for yourself. Think about what are some ways that I can improve my communication? Where do I fall short? How can I improve? Right. And so the rest of this is basically key terms. I'm not going to go through those. You can look those up or read over those yourself. But that is basically it for the first chapter. So basically we have learned the summary. Communication is a complex process through which one expresses, interprets, and coordinates messages with others. I would do that through that communication process. Communication involves message production, message interpretation, and interaction coordination. The characteristics of communication provide a foundation for practicing and improving communication skills. During communication, choices are made with ethical implications. And a competent communicator communicates effectively and ethically and overcomes communication apprehension through improvement plans. And that is it for chapter 1. Thanks so much for listening.